The world was on fire. It was World War II. But far away from the screaming bombs and the marching armies, there was a small speck of land in the vast Pacific Ocean. This place was called Anatahan. It's part of the Mariana Islands, a chain of volcanic peaks jutting out of the deep blue sea. Imagine a place forgotten by time, a place of dense, suffocating jungle, steep cliffs dropping straight into the churning ocean, and a volcano, always sleeping, but always there. This wasn't a tropical paradise, this was a trap, a beautiful green cage waiting for its prisoners. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of salt and damp earth. Into this wild and unforgiving place came our main characters. There were 32 men. Most were Japanese sailors from 3 different ships. They were young, strong, trained for war. The most important person in this story was a single Japanese woman. Her name was Kazuko Higa, a young woman from Okinawa who had come to the island with her husband, a plantation employee, the only woman in a world that would soon be filled with only men. Kazuko was not a soldier, an ordinary person in her early 20s. In June 1944, American warplanes screamed down from the clouds. The ships were torn apart by explosions and fire. The men who survived the attack swam for their lives. They saw the green hills of Anatahan in the distance and swam towards it. They were exhausted, wounded, terrified. The group of survivors was now complete. 32 men, 1 woman. At first, they probably believed they would be rescued soon. But no one came. Anatahan became a silent bubble, cut off from everything. They had no radio, no way to contact the outside world. All they knew was the island. Their world had shrunk to this 9-kilometer-long prison. On this isolated stage, a human drama was about to unfold. It would be a story of courage, but also of darkness. And soon, 33 souls would be caught in its powerful grip, forced to play a game where the rules were written in blood and desperation. The island of Anatahan is only about 9 kilometers long and less than 4 kilometers wide. The terrain was brutal. Jagged volcanic rock could tear your boots and your feet. The jungle canopy was so dense that in some places the sunlight never touched the ground. This was a primal world, a place that demanded respect. They had no idea that the real enemy wasn't the American soldiers they were expecting. The real enemy was the island itself, and the darkness that it would awaken within their own hearts. It was a ticking time bomb. On Anatahan, the first challenge was simple. Stay alive. You have to find water, food, shelter, fast. The real treasure was the abandoned coconut plantation. The coconuts provided food and drink. The survivors had to become hunters and gatherers. They learned to catch bats, lizards, and coconut crabs. They fished in the shallow waters along the coast. They foraged for edible plants and fruits in the jungle, learning by trial and error what was safe to eat and what was poison. They needed protection from the tropical storms and the scorching sun. They used what the island gave them. They chopped down palm trees and used the fronds to build thatched roofs. They built simple huts, small communities to give them a sense of order and safety. They also had a secret weapon. A crashed American B-29 bomber lay in the jungle. They scavenged metal from the plane to make knives, pots, and tools. They used the parachutes to make clothing. They were resourceful, turning the debris of war into the tools of survival. Life fell into a routine, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. The days were for work, tending to the small gardens they had planted with taro and sweet potatoes. They would gather around a fire, the flames pushing back the shadows. The fire was their comfort, a symbol of community. At first, they must have seen Kazuko as someone to protect. She was a piece of Japan in this strange and hostile land. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a marriage. She and Kikuichiro Higa held a small ceremony and were considered married by the group. For a short time it seemed to work, but it did not solve the underlying problem. It only put a lid on a pot that was already starting to boil. The men were young and full of testosterone, and every day they saw Kazuko. She was the only source of female companionship, the only object for their affection or lust. Jealousy began to grow like a poisonous vine in the jungle. They started competing for her attention in small ways. A special piece of fruit, a brave story from a hunt. They were like birds in a mating ritual, but this was no game. The situation became even more complicated. Kazuko's husband, Kikuichiro, disappeared. He was later found dead. Some said he fell from a tree while fishing. Others whispered that it was no accident. With him gone, Kazuko was once again available. The unspoken truce was broken. The men started to form factions. Friendships that had been forged in the struggle for survival began to break apart. The group was no longer a unit. It was a collection of individuals, each with his own desires and suspicions. The seeds of discord had been planted, and they were about to bear a very bitter fruit. After the death of her first island husband, Kazuko was pressured into another relationship. Soon after, the second man also died under mysterious circumstances. He drowned. Again, the official story was that it was an accident, but the whispers grew louder. The men started to look at each other with suspicion. Who was next? Was there a murderer among them? The fear was no longer just about the island, it was about each other. The group's structure completely fell apart. It was now a case of the strongest surviving. Two of the toughest men in the group found the pistols from the crashed B-29 bomber. They had been damaged, but the men managed to repair them. Suddenly the balance of power shifted dramatically. Before, conflicts were settled with fists or knives. Now there were guns. The two men with the pistols became the new leaders. They were the kings of the island. And they decided that they would share Kazuko. She was forced into a polyamorous relationship with these two armed men. She had no choice. Her life was in their hands. This new arrangement created a terrifying new dynamic. The two armed men were rivals, forced to share the queen. The other men were terrified of them. The island became a place of paranoia. A wrong look, a careless word, could get you killed. More men started to die. One man was stabbed, another disappeared into the jungle, never to be seen again. In total, about a dozen men died during their time on the island. Not from starvation or disease, but at the hands of their fellow castaways. Kazuko was at the center of this nightmare. She was a victim, a pawn in a deadly game played by desperate men. She lived in constant fear. She saw what was happening, how the desire for her was turning men into monsters. One day, one of the two armed husbands was shot and killed. The other men, tired of the tyranny and bloodshed, had finally decided that the situation could not continue. They came to a chilling conclusion. The problem wasn't the men. The problem, in their twisted view, was Kazuko. As long as she was on the island, men would continue to die. They decided that she had to be executed. Kazuko overheard the men plotting to kill her. She knew she had to escape. Her life depended on it. One night under the cover of darkness, she fled into the dense jungle. For the next month she lived alone, hiding in the wilderness she had come to know so well. She survived on her own, a true testament to her strength and will to live. One day she was walking along the beach when she saw a ship in the distance. It was an American vessel. This was her chance. She waved frantically, using a piece of cloth to signal them. The ship saw her and came closer. She was taken aboard, finally safe after 6 long years of hell. She told the Americans her story. The year was 1950. The war had been over for 5 years. The Americans tried to convince the men on the island to surrender, but the men refused to believe it. Their long, private war was finally over. When Kazuko Higa and the surviving men returned to Japan, they expected to be welcomed as heroes. But the Japan they returned to was not the one they had left. It was a country defeated, occupied, struggling to rebuild. Instead of being hailed as heroes, the castaways of Anatahan became a media sensation. Their story wasn't seen as heroic survival. It became a shocking scandal. The newspapers were filled with sensational headlines about the queen and her harem of 32 men. Kazuko in particular was treated horribly by the press and the public. She was portrayed as a seductress, a femme fatale. They called her the Queen Bee of Anatahan. She was blamed for the deaths and the violence. She tried to capitalize on her fame. She even starred in a stage play about her experience, but she was forever marked by the scandal. She eventually remarried and tried to live a quiet life. But the shadow of Anatahan followed her until her death in her early 50s. The men also struggled to readjust to life in a changed Japan. They were relics of a bygone era. They had survived the island, but the island never truly left them. They carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The story was made into a movie in 1953, directed by Josef von Sternberg. But the film, like newspapers, focused on sex and violence. Survivors became characters. Their suffering turned into entertainment. The story of Anatahan is more than just a shocking tale of survival. It is a powerful lesson about human nature. It shows what can happen when the rules of society are stripped away. The men on the island were soldiers and sailors, trained to be disciplined and honorable. But in the face of isolation, fear, and primal desires, that training crumbled. The island became a laboratory, a social experiment, and the results were dark and disturbing. It shows that the civilization we build around ourselves is a fragile thing. This story also teaches us about the incredible strength of the human will to survive. Kazuko in particular showed amazing resilience. She found the courage to escape and save her own life. However, the tale also serves as a stark warning. It shows how easily a group can turn on itself. It's a reminder that our greatest danger is often not the wilderness or the elements but each other. The real monsters are not always in the jungle, sometimes they are within us. Ultimately, the Anatahan incident is a story of extremes, extreme isolation, extreme desperation, and extreme behavior. It forces us to ask ourselves some tough questions. What would I do in that situation? Would I be a leader, a follower, or a victim? Would I hold on to my humanity, or would I let the jungle inside me take over? We may never have to face a trial like the one on Anatahan, but the story remains a powerful and timeless reminder of the thin line between civilization and chaos, and the darkness and the light that exist within every human heart. It's a true story of man and woman versus the wild, and ultimately versus themselves.